Hello and welcome in Falcha to Random Thoughts from County Antrim on this the 14th day of February 2021. Now we are exactly 1 month away from the Random Thoughts Story Swap, Roman numeral 1. Now I announced this last week. It's going to be on Sunday, March 14th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this is the Sunday before St. Patrick's Day. And if you weren't listening last week, or if you were but ignored the announcement, I'll repeat it. On Sunday, March 14th, Random Thoughts will host a story swap. And I'll tell a story to get things started, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to tell the story of your choice. Now I haven't decided what story I'm going to tell yet, but it'll be a short one because I want to leave it open to you to tell your stories. And the audience will complete the rest of the half hour of stories. Anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes longer, maybe less, maybe more, who knows. We'll see. I'm prepping my granddaughter to tell a story because she's a real motor mouth, and I think I could con her to tell a wee little story on this story swap. And if you think I'm putting pressure on you to come up with a story, I'm actually putting more pressure on me, because I've never hosted a video conference and I have no frickin' idea how to do this. But I have 1 month to prepare. I'm also a little nervous that no one will show up. It's like having a party where no one shows up. So please, don't let me down. Join us at the story swap and bring with it one of your stories. I've often been asked, how do you come up with your stories? And frankly, sometimes it is difficult, more difficult than others. But sometimes my stories come from simply asking myself one question: why? If you look at anything, almost anything, everything, things you take for granted, and simply ask yourself, why? Why do we drive on the right side of the road? Why do we measure things in inches and miles instead of the metric system? And who came up with the metric system anyway? But if you ask yourself any question, why, how, go and do some research and do some thinking about it, you'll also find out many times you've come up with a story. I'll just give you a quick example. I have my keyboard sitting here in front of me. I once did a short piece on QWERTY. Now you all know what QWERTY is. You use QWERTY every day. And if you don't know what it is, take a look at your keyboard. If you're on the computer now, look at it now, or take a look at it the next time you do. And you'll notice the letters are not arrayed in alphabetical order. There seem to be a random array of letters on your keyboard. And all of us have the exact same array of letters. And if you look at the top row, left to right, what does it spell? The first 5 letters. QWERTY. QWERTY. And I once looked at my keyboard. This was years ago. I looked at my keyboard and I said, why? Who came up with that? And why did they come up with that? And I did some research and I came up with a marvelous story. Because typewriters are just fascinating devices, a wonderful invention well over 100 years ago, which kind of revolutionized communication. And I found that the old keyboards were a whole variety of layouts. But somebody came up with the notion of the particular array, the QWERTY array of letters, and that became the standard. So for 100 years, every typewriter, at least in the English language, was arrayed the same way. And when computers were invented, keyboards just adopted the old typewriter array, and that's what we're still using. Well over 100 years after some guy thought of QWERTY. Now, that's a great way to think of a story. Just try to come up with anything. Look at anything and just ask yourself why. And you might come up with a story. But use whatever method you wish. Come up with a story and share it with us. If you want my help, just send me an email or a Facebook message. I can give you my phone number. We can chat. And if you're in reasonable proximity, maybe we can even meet with, of course, proper social distancing. So we now have 4 weeks. Me to learn how to use video conferencing and you to come up with a story. 4 weeks. That's plenty of time. Now, speaking of time, time, of course, is important. We all waste time. In our world that prizes work ethic, wasting time is not a good thing. We should all be productive. And I practiced a profession for many years where time was very important. I was always in a deadline. So I had to become very, very efficient in the use of my time. But things have changed a little bit. I'm retired now. I don't have quite the pressing demands on my time. And of course, with the pandemic, there's not much you can do anyway. So time is less important to me. Which reminds me, actually, I know a farmer, County Cavan in Ireland. And he has a small farm there, and it's not the greatest farm in the world. The soil is not particularly fertile, so he doesn't grow much. He mainly raises pigs, and he doesn't do much with his pigs. He lets them roam around the field and into the woods, and they eat acorns and berries and leaves on plants, whatever they can forage around and roam around and find. And this seems to work pretty well for the farmer, and pretty well for the hogs, for that matter. There was a day not too long ago that the county agent came by and paid him a visit. And he toured the farm, watched the hogs roam free. And the agent wanted to be helpful because, of course, that's his job, to be helpful, to help farmers be more productive. And the farm agent said, you ought to keep your hogs in a pen and feed them commercial hog feed. And on a balanced diet, the hogs will grow fatter, much, much fatter. And of course, time was the crux of his argument. And he says, the agent said, you will save a lot of time. And my friend, the farmer, he was a bit perplexed by this, and he scratched his head a little bit and thought about it. And then he turned to the farm agent and said, what's time to a hog? Now that kind of describes my life today, now that I'm retired, now that I'm no longer practicing a profession where I no longer have to value efficiency, and I'm kind of stuck in this pandemic anyway. So I guess I've simply turned into a hog. And what's time to a hog? So I wanted to give you, with that lesson on time, I want to talk to you about schools. Schools locally and schools in Ireland. Our local school district committed to in-school learning this year, despite the pandemic. And they've done a commendable job. They enacted an awful lot of strict protocols and did a pretty good job of keeping the schools safe. And we've had in-school learning September through December with a couple of exceptions. They had to close down school for a week or two in November because of a number of cases, not so much in the school, but in the community. They started the holiday season a week early in December for much the same reason. There was a big uptick in cases in the community. But they started school right back up in January, and we've had school every school day, just about every school day, until last Thursday. There were a couple of cases in the school, this time involving students. And they keep the kids pretty segregated class by class. So they had a case in a school. So they just shut down that grade level. Everyone went home, and they are in quarantine for 14 days. And then they had another case in a school, and that whole class went into quarantine. And then what they faced end of the week and the coming week is a number of teachers and staff members and substitute teachers who were exposed to the virus outside of the school, and as a result had to be quarantined for 14 days. And the school simply does not have the staff to run a school. So they have shut down for 2 days last week, and it'll be 5 days next week. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's a huge outbreak in our local community. I'm only trying to highlight how fragile things are for schools in this pandemic. Which kind of leads me to the topic I wanted to talk about today. I had on my list of things to talk about on a podcast, the Hedge Schools of Ireland. Today's probably as good a day as any to talk about the Hedge Schools, because I think the Hedge Schools demonstrate, as does the effort of most school districts in this pandemic, demonstrates the resilience and the dedication and the persistence of schools and of teachers and of parents. So, okay, what are Hedge Schools? Well, they were very, very informal and unofficial and very local and also very illegal schools that served as the education system in Ireland for almost 200 years. Now, the Irish had a system of schools before then. They were usually called the Bardic schools, and they were secular schools, and of course taught in the Irish language. They taught language and literature and history and culture, Brehon law, and other things for many, many hundreds of years, until Oliver Cromwell came along in the mid-1600s. And Cromwell outlawed the Bardic schools. Now, he did that in addition to massacring a lot of people, in addition to confiscating the land of the Irish. So Cromwell is not a very liked man in Irish history, not very well liked in England as well, for that matter. But he called the Bardic schools Popish schools. Not because they taught religion or were Catholic schools, but in his words, they taught superstition and idolatry and the evil Celtic customs. They were Popish schools because Catholics went to them, not because Catholicism was taught. Banned all the schools. Now, a few decades after that, back when William of Orange was the King of Great Britain, Britain enacted the penal laws. And the penal laws were intended to stamp out Catholicism in Ireland. And it banned priests, and they banned religious schools. And they banned the teaching of Catholicism, whether it was at school or at churches or wherever. So now you had the Bardic schools banned and any sort of religious education banned in the 1600s in Ireland. Now, did this mean that the Irish went without schools? The answer is no, because it led to a very different, unorganized, but somewhat effective system of education. These schools that grew up from those bans were sometimes called secret schools, sometimes called pay schools, but most often called hedge schools. And what happened is just local people found or recruited or hired a teacher. And the teacher and the students met secretly, somewhere out of sight of the local officials, often in a barn or somebody's parlor or an abandoned hut, usually out of town, perhaps on a riverbank or in a grove of trees, or quite often behind a row of hedges. and that's how they became known as hedge schools. Now, usually one of the students or perhaps a parent would act as a lookout. They would stand just outside the group of students, keeping a lookout for law enforcement or a informant. And the school would not meet at the same place every day. They would move around. They moved around in order to avoid detection, because they were, after all, illegal. Now, the hedge schools did not have a faculty per se. They usually had a single teacher who was called the headmaster. And the headmaster was sometimes paid a shilling or two if the town could afford it, the locals could afford it. It often just provided a place to stay, somebody's spare room or an abandoned hut someplace. They were given, the headmaster was given handouts of food by people in the community. Even the poor would find something to spare so that their kids could go to school and their headmaster could survive. Now, what were the kids taught? Well, they were taught. The early hedge schools were actually, some of them, not all of them, but some of them were taught by priests. So they had some religion that was taught at the schools. But most of the hedge schools were secular schools. The focus was on reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, but all in the Irish language. But essentially they were taught whatever it was that the headmaster knew. And sometimes this had even included Latin and Greek and the classics. I saw a journal entry. I was doing some looking at hedge schools, and I saw a journal entry by a French man who was traveling in Ireland in the 1700s. And this French man saw a boy who was dressed in rags and bare feet. And the Frenchman stopped to talk to him. And the boy could not speak English. He spoke in Irish, but the Frenchman knew a wee bit of Irish, enough that he was able to communicate. And as they chatted, the Frenchman was just shocked. He was shocked to discover that this boy could recite poetry in Latin. And that this boy, in rags and bare feet, could quote the work of ancient Greek scholars. And that might give you some idea of the quality of the education at the hedge schools. Now, in the late 1700s, Cromwell was in the mid-1600s. In the late 1700s, the penal laws were relaxed a bit, and this just amounted to a new form of penal laws. They weren't abolished, they were just relaxed. And under the new penal laws, a school could be established, but it required a license. And the licenses were granted by the local Anglican bishop. And the bishop, the Protestant bishop, could grant or withdraw a license at will. So you had to satisfy the bishop. Now, a number of Catholic parishes set up schools under this system. And of course, they got a license from the Protestant bishop. And what Irish saw, was a dramatic shift, I think, in the Catholic Church around that time, evolving over the next many, many decades. And the church kind of recognized that a person could be a good Catholic and a loyal British subject at the same time. So these schools, the Catholic schools, the parish schools, taught religion, and they taught the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. But they also taught people to obey the laws of the British. And they also taught students English, and classes were instructed in English. Now, there are many Irish families who just could not agree with this. So the Hedge Schools continued. They continued from the 1600s into the 1700s when the penal laws were relaxed, but they continued another 100 years, well into the 19th century, well into the 1800s. And it was because they became entirely secular, with no cooperation from the church, but they taught things in Irish, in the Irish language, and with a focus, besides the 3 R's, they focused on Irish history and Irish culture and Irish literature. Now, the Hedge Schools really didn't decline until after 1829. 1829. It was the year that the British Parliament passed the Catholic Emancipation Act. And among other things, that act gave Catholics the right to vote. And there was also a movement right around that time, the mid-1800s, and a movement not only in Ireland, but in England and in America at the same time, to provide free public education. And the Catholic churches set up their own parish schools in addition to that. And it was a time, that mid-1800s, when the church, perhaps ironically, the priests and church officials became most vocal critics of the Hedge Schools. And that doesn't negate the importance or the influence of the Hedge Schools when they did exist. And it's hard to tell because how many there were, how many kids were educated in the Hedge Schools over a 200-year period. Because, again, they were illegal. Most of them were small, and they were floating from place to place. And students came in and out and moved, and headmasters moved, etc. So it's tough to get a good count. But I saw one estimate in a scholarly journal that was trying to sort this out. And they estimated that in the 1840s, there were over 400,000 children attending Hedge Schools in Ireland. And at about that same time, there was another estimate of the number of Hedge Schools in Ireland, and they came up with 9,000. It was probably 9,000 different Hedge Schools in Ireland at any given time in the early to mid-1800s. And that was, for 200 years, the Irish educational system, the illegal, locally organized, floating Hedge Schools. As most of you know, I tell a lot of stories at Irish festivals and many other venues as well. At least I did before the pandemic, and hopefully I will after, if there is an after the pandemic. Now, I rarely get to do my thing at the main stage. I have at times, but not as often as I would like. And it's certainly great being in the main stage in a big tent with 1,000 or more seats. It's a real hoot when you're able to perform before a big crowd. But most often I'm put in one of the much smaller tents before a crowd of 30 or 40 people, and sometimes even much less. And these tents, these smaller tents, usually have names. I mean, there's some festivals that are not creative and very creative, and I'll be under tent number 3. But usually they're named after, quite often, they're named after sponsors of the festival. So I might be, for example, in O'Reilly's Insurance Agency tent, because they bought the naming rights for the tent during the festival. But most often these tents, where they put me and people like me, are called the cultural tent. And the presenters in the cultural tent just talk about various aspects of Irish history, Irish culture, Irish traditions. And each one of us has a 45-minute or 1-hour set spread out over the day. And I really enjoy those because what I find is, Irish festivals are all about music and beer, which is why they're so much fun. But Irish Americans are just eager to learn about their heritage. And they're like sponges. They really soak it up because there's so much they want to know that they don't know. And so these cultural tents, whenever I'm in one, seems to be, even though they're relatively small, they're usually packed, which is what I really enjoy. But I've been to many festivals where they have yet another name for this cultural tent. And they call this tent the Hedge School. And I love speaking at the Hedge School. In fact, really nothing, makes me prouder than being a headmaster at a hedge school. So that's the end of this podcast today. Don't forget to get your story ready on for the 14th day of March. Take a look at my website, clandonald.net. I'll be doing a blast, I think a Facebook blast, and some things on my website about the story swap. Story swap Roman numeral 1. And if it doesn't succeed, we'll never have a story swap Roman numeral 2. Actually, Roman numeral 2 is this. This is 2 to the rest of us. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com and take a look at my Facebook page. And keep in touch. That's all you can do in a pandemic, is do the best you can to keep in touch. So that's it for now. See you all next week.